What a vibe we have tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and non-binary folks. I am Charlie, and this is the podcast launch of the That Makes Sense to Me TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube channels. Many of you have spoken to me in comments. Many of you have requested longer form content. Sorry, as I move closer and further away from the mic, because I'm trying to figure out how the hell to do this. This will be the inaugural episode of the That Makes Sense to Me podcast. And since I don't like to make my job easy, I want to start us off with a ridiculously complicated question, which is race a social construct? That is a loaded question. I've made videos about this on my channel before, and if you've been on my channel in the past, you will know that I've hinted at this, but I've never actually taken the time to piece through the argument. And I was inspired to piece through the argument because I saw not Rebecca Larson, different Rebecca, the white woman whisperer Rebecca, ask the question of when is a time that you changed your mind? And this is specifically one of the times that I changed my mind as an adult. There's many examples of me changing my mind over the years, right? My philosophy changed, everything changed, time changed. I grew up in an extremely religious household. I was taught that it was morally wrong to be gay, and that had to change, right? There's been many momentous shifts, but this shift in perception of race being a social construct as opposed to being a biological only reality was a shift that happened to me as an adult and somewhat recently. So I want to break down, since it will be easier to understand, why I initially resisted this idea, and then finally, why I finally acquiesced when all these black women were telling me that race is socially constructed, and I didn't want to believe them. Something eventually finally changed my mind, and I want to give you what that is. And I think that the long form is more appropriate to that. As a little bit of logistical housekeeping, and I'm just saying this to myself if I'm being honest, because this is the first time we're doing these super long form shenanigans, my goal is to give you a high quality audio experience and to go deeper into topics that we usually just have to breeze through on TikTok. Also, I have to not burn an entire week of my life every time I make one of these episodes. So I'm going to attempt to include a couple more coughs and a couple more stutters, just for the sake of actually getting this thing to production and out in the world. And as it goes on, it will improve. We will add guests. I've already spoken to several professors who are interested in being on the channel, whose books I've already discussed. And it's going to develop and grow, but it's going to develop and grow out in public because that is part of how my channel works. Great. Housekeeping disclaimers out of the way. One more final one is that Patreon remains the best way to support me at this time. I'm trying to lock in those brand deals, but it's taking a long time and it's a hustle. So, truthfully, the most important thing that you can do is brand deals. Sorry, that's the most important thing for me to do. The most important thing that you can do is join on Patreon. That's the most stable thing. We're at about 140 Patreon supporters right now, which is astonishing and amazing, but I cannot wait. But we're not where we need to be financially, we being me, and I want to continue doing this. So I've been rambling for too long. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this, which is going to be breaking down the question of whether or not race is a social construct. Spoiler warning, it is, but how do we get there? We're going to talk specifically about the work of Ruha Benjamin's book, Race After Technology, and Dorothy Roberts' book, Fatal Invention. I'm Charlie. This is That Makes Sense to Me, the podcast, and I don't have any sticky tabs to wave in front of you because I'm hiding in a closet at 1 a.m, well, almost 1 a.m. So let's start with, I was reading the book Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. And in that book, she just said this as if it was a fact, like race is a social construct. And I thought, no, that doesn't make sense to me. I am a bioethicist in training. It doesn't make logical sense to me to say that race is a social construct when just look at the skin, literally the skin. Skin is a genetically determined thing, and skin color is different across different races. So therefore, skin color is different across different races. That's genetically determined. That's biologically determined. It is nonsense to think of race as a social construct in this simple biological way of viewing the world. And if that's your perception of the world, I understand where you're coming from, because I believe that for a really long time. And what we need to do is add a little nuance to that. Pausing for water breaks. I need a water bottle that doesn't make horrible sounds. We're going to unscrew that. Or a mute button. I don't know. We'll see. Great. If you are well entrenched in this, you might think that there are even more sophisticated, complex reasons to believe that race is not a social construct, right? There are examples of, I do not know the proper name for their culture. That is embarrassing. I should have looked that up in advance. We're learning on the fly. Folks that live in mountain ranges, right, have higher hemoglobin counts, right? Folks that live along the beaches and dive for food underwater can hold their breath for longer, not just as a matter of training, but seemingly as a matter of genetics. And as I've mentioned, with skin itself, folks with low melanin, like myself, can get more vitamin D out of less sunlight than folks, but we're more inclined to get super sunburned literally just being outside. So these genetic trade-offs seem to manifest as biological realities that show up in the world. The problem with this is that a lot of people then take that way of looking at the world and they extend and overextend and over-extrapolate how race could be biologically determined in certain ways and map it onto what amount to racial stereotypes that were created by society. So example of a tragic example, and I didn't mention her name at the top of the pod, but a tragic example of this comes from the work of Harriet Washington, who wrote the book Medical Apartheid. There are doctors, living current doctors right now, who believe that black people have a higher pain tolerance and or have thicker skin as a result of these genetic differences, perceived genetic differences. This is not true, and it is in fact dangerous because it manifests in doctors not listening to black patients when they report pain. It is popular knowledge, it is collective knowledge at this point that there is a gap in the birth weights across races in the United States. Black women are more likely to die in childbirth as a result of living in this racist society around doctors who do not take their pain seriously, and in a world where epigenetic forces, nutritional forces, living in food deserts, etc., and poverty combine to lead to a higher rate of death. But if it were, and so it introduces a bit of an appeal. We can let ourselves off the hook if we can explain this racial difference as a result of biological determinism. Let's break that down because that's a sort of fancy, complicated claim. What do I mean by we can let ourselves off the hook? So we perceive in the data that black women are more likely to die in childbirth. And we also perceive that it doesn't seem to have to do with socioeconomic status. Even rich black women, highly successful black women, suffer the same decline in maternal mortality. I believe, and I believe the data shows, and I believe that you should believe, that we can explain that discrepancy as a result of race being a social construct. Or rather, before we get to that, we can explain that discrepancy as a result of racism baked into society, following the work of Harriet Washington. We know that there is a medical care gap in this country. And so my interpretation and understanding of that hypothesis, which I believe is the correct interpretation, is that ingrained, embedded systemic racism is the cause of the maternal mortality gap. And that sounds plausible to me. But the problem with saying that in such an abstract way, what I'm really saying, if we just peel one more layer away, is that more black women are dying in hospitals as a result of racism. That's the simple way to say it, without the fancy academic words. And believing that biological determinism, believing that actually not, it's not racism that's the cause of that. Racism didn't cause that. Really what the cause of that is, big air quotes for those of you that are listening in audio. It's really genetic differences, right? Um, and this is where we start to see hints of why this understanding of the world is so dangerous, because the concept here is actually we're off the hook. Oh, well, yes, the data does say that black women are more likely to die in childbirth. The data does say that black women are dying in hospitals more than white women. If we explain that in terms of genetics, then we don't have to do anything about it. It's not a moral thing. It's not a moral failing of our culture and our history. It's just the way that things are. And that argument of it just being the way things are might ring a lot of bells, because it actually opens the door to a lot of the racial dark sides that we have seen throughout history. Because it isn't just these nuanced cases of like the maternal mortality gap. Is the explanation for the maternal mortality gap biological or social? Right? Intelligent people could disagree on that, right? I don't believe it, obviously. I'm just blathering on about it at a microphone in a closet at 1 a.m. for a long time about this. I do not believe that it's just a biological difference that is just the way that things are. I have reasons to believe that, and we'll talk through some of them as we try to unpack this claim of whether or not race is a social construct. But it's at least plausible, right? It's at least plausible to believe that. And I think it's important to admit that, because I want to reach to the people who, like me, when they hear the claim race is a social construct, kind of ruffle their intellectual feathers. And they're like, no, I don't know about that. That doesn't seem right. So to add another layer to this, actually, before I add another layer, we can take this entirely in the direction of much more harmful stereotypes. For instance, you could fall into the stereotype that is widely discussed by Bryan Stevenson, and also I'm blanking on the name which is embarrassing. The author of the New Jim Crow, the Michelle Alexander, the author of the New Jim Crow, have discussed this in great detail. And what they discussed is another kind of stereotype that manifests in society, which is if you look at the data, just analogous to the maternal mortality gap. If you look at the data, it looks like there's a criminality gap too. It looks like if you perceive, it looks like there's a lot more black people in prison than white people. And I obviously, just like the maternal mortality gap, believe and know, knowledge is justified true belief, that there is a social explanation for that, in the form of over-policing and the form of redlining. But just like you could explain that with social forces, you could also, in theory, plausibly, even though I disagree, you could possibly explain that in terms of genetic causes. And that's where you have to be really, really careful. Because if you peel another layer back away from that, what you're actually saying is what Michelle Alexander said, what Bryan Stevenson said, which is you are expressing the mythology of black criminality. And that goes in air quotes too, right? The mythology of black criminality has a deep history in our culture. It goes all the way back to the slave patrols, and it goes back to the KKK, and it goes back to all these things. We have these videos. The video Birth of a Nation is discussed in the Netflix documentary 13th. It is propaganda that black people are more criminal than white people. Which I know because I have uncles and aunts at Thanksgiving, just like you. Some of you won't believe. You'll be like, no, it isn't propaganda. And your ruffled feathers will come back and you'll say, no, it's not propaganda. It is, and then here's the air quotes again for those that are listening. It is an intrinsic racial difference. Preposterous, right? Preposterous. It can't be an intrinsic racial difference. It's so many levels of circular reasoning. It's circular reasoning baked on circular reasoning, baked on circular reasoning, that it's a wonder that it hasn't all collapsed. So let's break that down. In the case of mass incarceration, we take the data point that there seem to be more black people in prison than white people, or we take a more tragic data point, like the case of Jimmy Dill, who I get emotional when I think about and talk about. Jimmy Dill was executed, even though he didn't need to be, according to the legal system. When you look at the data, you could see that there are more executions for black men in America than for white men in America, and that you're more likely to be executed. I can't get this data all the way right. It's in a footnote on in Bryan Stevenson, like I want to say page 50. I'll throw some notes below. You're more likely to be sentenced to death if you're black in this country than if you're white. It is much easier for me as a person who studies and reads this to say that the reason that that happens is because of the racism of the judges, just like the maternal mortality gap happens as a result of the racism of the doctors and the medical system. That to me is the most plausible and easy explanation. But we can let ourselves off the hook if we buy into this biological determinism. We can let ourselves off the hook if we buy into the mythology of black criminality. If we allow ourselves to say, well, yes, the data does seem to say that there is more black criminality. But the reason for that data, the real true cause, and now I'm in air quotes and I got to change the tone so people don't think that I actually believe this, right? The real reason for that is just because, they're like that, or some horrible way of explaining. I'm trying to cosplay as some uncle at Thanksgiving, right? Well, that's just the way that they are, and that to me is a dangerous misstep of this concept that race is a biological thing as opposed to a socially constructed thing. So I hope that that's clear. I hope we can break that down in this context, right? Part of the reason that it is appealing to so many people to make this claim that race is biologically real and not socially constructed is because it lets us off the hook morally for the tragedies of our history and our present. That maternal mortality gap is right now. That black-white incarceration gap is right now. These digital discrimination gaps that I've discussed in many other videos are right now. And we can just let ourselves off the hook if we buy into these racist notions. Naturally, I want to reject them. And I want to reject them in a specific way which breaks down why I have come to believe that race is finally a social construct. So to do that, I want to look at the work of Resmaa Menakem, as well as Ruha Benjamin and Dorothy Roberts. I explained this in a TikTok, but we're going to go 17 levels more deep. In the United States, there is not just a maternal mortality gap, but there is also a fetal birth weight gap. That is, let me say that differently. Black babies in this country are born weighing less than white babies in this country. And that's really easy to be like, oh, well, of course that's genetically caused, right? It's genetics, it's biology, it's a baby. The baby hasn't done shit yet. They're just being born. Obviously, it can't be racism because the baby just popped into the world. Nobody was able to do anything racist to them. I'm getting carried away with this anger for a second, but just it's really easy to lean on a biological explanation for a fetal birth weight gap. But the reality is more tragic, right? It isn't a genetic effect. It is, in fact, an effect of stress on mothers that is measurable. How do I know that? Because there was a follow-up study that was done about women, Arab women with Arab-sounding names. And post 9/11, the rise in anti-Arab sentiment was high. People were very scared. White people were very scared. And as a result, there was a measurable uptick in anti-Arab sentiment. This anti-Arab sentiment showed up in babies. It showed up in the fetal birth weight gap. Because if you're a mother and you are fearing for your life on a day-to-day basis while you're attempting to gestate a child, that stress shows up in the baby. This is also a concept that many of you will have heard of, right? The phrase that gets used is epigenetic stress inheritance. We've heard this before. Many of you will be familiar with this. There's nuances there, but I think we'll pack the nuances into a different podcast and focus on the concept of race as social constructed here. How do we know that it was as a result of anti-Arab sentiment and not genetics? Two reasons. First, those same ethnic groups in other countries didn't have the fetal birth weight gap, right? If you take an African person in Africa, their child is going to be controlling for all the factors, right? I'm being fast and loose with some of these details here. But let's just say it this way. A black person in a country that is racist like America and is like ethnically Kenyan, for instance, is more likely to have an underweight baby in a racist country like the U.S. than in their own country or in a country with less racism. We know this because of the second one, which is even Arab women with the same ethnicity, with the same cultural background, ended up having differences in birth weights because of one factor, which is how their name sounded. If their name sounded Muslim, if their name sounded foreign, if they had a non-white conforming name, there was a measurable difference between the birth weight of their children. So biology cannot be the explanation for this, right? This is a cultural phenomenon. It's a measurable cultural phenomenon that spiked after 9/11 and then went back to regular following the years after. I assume. I haven't looked at that data. But the people with the follow-up studies, I want to be very clear. I'm going to try to be hair-splitty and so that you know that I'm but the follow-up studies were done, right? So let's just put it all in order. The maternal mortality gap exists as a result of racist doctors. But the fetal birth weight gap exists as a result of differences in levels of stress as a result of racial resentment and racial tensions that is measurable in different countries. So we can actually flip the script on this this frame, right? People are saying, oh, it has to be genetic because you showed up in society and there was already a difference. And in reality, that example gives us just the clearest way of starting to tread into this idea that race is something that we create. It isn't something that naturally occurs in the way that people traditionally use that word. I will explain one more level of that following just this next bit. So, never done a podcast before. Pausing at this point. Hopefully, in the future, we will have sponsorship breaks and we will talk through a bunch of different things. But don't have those yet. We'll get there soon. Pausing for a little water. The other thing that you can do is join on YouTube. If you're not in a position to join on Patreon, which I know many of you are not, we could join on just subscribing on YouTube is very helpful to me. Remonetizing YouTube and turning that into a stable revenue stream is one of my channel's priorities right now. So I would very much appreciate it if you could subscribe on YouTube in lieu of me not having a sponsor. Great. Okay, so where does this leave us? It leaves us with a complicated question, which we can break down in a simple way. Dorothy Roberts, I will say, in her book, breaks down genetic modeling at a level of detail that I don't think really fits in a podcast, but I want to gesture at before I move on. And the easiest way to gesture at it is to say that contemporary genetic science is in many ways replicating phrenology. Many of you will probably be familiar with phrenology. Phrenology was a fake, made-up science that basically believed that you could determine things about a person if you just measured their skull, which is preposterous. And phrenology was famously used as a way of reifying racial differences in science. Reifying, like making real, as a way to lend credence to the racist assumptions of eugenicist scientists of old and of present. And many of those tools, or some of those tools, I should say, are beginning to show up in the way that we do genetic modeling. I'm going to gesture at this, and I'm going to leave it a little bit underexplained, and I'll maybe do a deep dive in it later if people are interested. But basically, all genetic modeling is statistical modeling. People's genomes differ wildly. There's a theorem in the book called or I didn't call it this, I just think of it this way, that if you took two random this will invoke more cultural stereotypes for a bit to make this easier to understand. If you took two random people in a black church and compared their genetic differences statistically, their genetic differences would be greater than the average difference between a black church and a white church. I know that didn't make sense to a lot of people, so we'll just say this again. We think of genetic differences across races as having certain cultural values or of being important somehow. They are not. If you look at the average genetic difference from a black church to a white church, it's a pretty small difference, right? In terms of personality, in terms of IQ, in terms of all the important things about what makes you a human, those differences statistically disappear across races. There's more there's more cross. It's hard to keep all these words straight, but I'm going to try to do it for the sake of conciseness. There is more difference between two random people, intra-race difference between two random people, than there is inter-race differences between the statistical average of people. I told you it wasn't going to make sense in a podcast. I have to make a YouTube video about it. I have to show you some visuals, or you can read Fatal Invention by Dorothy where she goes into detail. I feel like I lost a lot of you, so I'm going to pull it back. Let's pull it back to where we were starting and where we were trying to go, which is race differences and phrenology and contemporary genetic science. Your DNA is a list of a bunch of letters, and you can't compare it letter by letter. You have to compare statistical models and statistical chunks across statistical data sets. And many of the researchers that are, because pharmaceutical companies are incentivized right now to make racially specifically targeted drugs, you can read more details about this in the Fatal Invention book, because pharmacists are specifically targeting this. The people doing the studies are putting their thumb on the statistical scale. The people doing the racial studies right now they're not doing phrenology exactly, but they are imposing categories onto a data set that defies our traditional categories. Putting that a little bit differently, the statistical models that are that we just take if we had a super robot that got every single person's genetic data in the world, which would be a terrible idea for privacy reasons, and because the police state would use it, whatever. If you got everybody's genetic data in the entire whole universe, and you tried to get racial categories at it, you threw it at a super computer and we're like, tell us what the racial categories are. It would not spit out the categories that we have. It wouldn't spit out black, white, and Asian. It wouldn't do that. And South Asian, it wouldn't do that. We impose those categories on the data. And maybe this is fast and loose. This is something I haven't thought of in advance, so I'll try to be careful here with this one. But there's been a recent controversy about the skin tone of Cleopatra in a recent casting of a historical movie about this, right? There's a massive diversity of skin tones across Africa. There's no African race. Africa has a tremendous racial variety. And an Egyptian is going to have more. I can't remember the exact specific. I guess I did read this. I'm not totally making this up. I can't remember the exact countries involved, but the genetic difference between an Egyptian and a Syrian is going to be so close compared to an Egyptian and a South African or someone from Zimbabwe. Right, or someone from the Congo even. Africa, black as a country, black as a race coming from Africa, is way too broad a category. It's preposterous to try to include so many ethnic groups and nationalities into this one racial category. The genetic models are going to spit out a lot of different races from the entire continent of Africa. But these researchers that are working in part in conjunction with pharmaceutical companies that want to use clean, socially constructed categories will impose categories onto the data. Said it before, say it again. They're putting their thumb on the scale in terms of categorization. That's wild, and it's worth dwelling on. What it means is that even on the cutting edge of science, we are imposing racial categories onto the world. I'll say that again. Even on the cutting edge of science, we are the ones imposing the racial categories on the world. And I said this word before, which is reify, is a stupid fancy word. Re, I think, is Latin for like a thing. Reify means to thingify. And like, we are the ones reifying race. I'll say that again. We're the ones making race a thing. We are reifying race through our social perception of it, the categories that we create, and critically, the individual decisions we make on a day-to-day basis, and the collective social decisions that we make. And this, finally, now we have enough of the pieces on the table to finally put together what it really means that race is socially constructed. So think back to the maternal mortality gap. Are Black women genetically predisposed to die in childbirth? No. We make that happen. We make that happen because of the racism of the medical system. So we create a Black-white maternal mortality gap. It's not natural. It's something we imposed. Is there a gap in incarceration? Yes. Because we over-police. Because we decided that certain drugs, the drugs that Black people mostly did, should have harsher sentences than other drugs that white people did. We made race real. We created those racial gaps. We reified race in that concept. Because now, somebody with a racist mindset, somebody who doesn't want to, let me back up, let me not be as harsh about this. Somebody who hasn't had time to read all these books, somebody who hasn't had time to break all this down, will just see the stereotype and conclude the biology instead of recognizing that the stereotype was something that we created and then it showed up in the biology. And to say that it showed up in the biology might sound preposterous because we live in a mechanistic, we have lots of religions, right? But we live in a post-Enlightenment world. We live in a post-scientific revolution world. We see the world in a very scientific, deterministic way. Atoms and molecules cause the chemistry of the body. The chemistry of the body causes DNA. DNA causes who we are. That is a reductive materialist determinist way of viewing the world. This is not how I view the world, but to go into that, we'd be doing philosophy. I believe that I am a compatibilist, which is a term for a person who believes in free will and also determinism. It's a thing. Look it up. And if you don't want to look it up, I made a whole YouTube video about it where I talked about Arrival versus Lucy and different visions of time and determinism. And I've been talking about this for a bit. But to get off my philosophical high horse and get back down to earth, because I know that most of those words were needlessly gatekeepy, and sorry about that. I'll explain them in further content. I do not enjoy when philosophers say fancy things for the sake of sounding smarter than other people. That is something I also used to be like and try to avoid. So I will say that claim in a different way and then try to get back onto the track that we're on. We didn't always, a classic example that I think came from Radiolab, or it might have been Invisibilia. We used to think that digestion was like magic. We ate food and then what came out of us was not food. How did that happen? Magic, spirits, right? Until some poor soul got wounded and is shot or sliced, or I don't know, and his stomach, I'm so sorry that we're doing this. I should cut this whole bit out, but we're going with it. It wasn't until somebody accidentally happened to see partially digested food that people were like, whoa, maybe it's not like humors, maybe it's not spirit, or like the animus life force or whatever that's magically transforming food. Maybe it's just chemistry. And then we figured out that it was chemistry. There's been so many examples of this throughout the years. We used to think that your personality was entirely determined by consciousness, but now we perceive many elements of consciousness to be, in fact, created by the chemistry of your brain. I am a person that has been on antidepressants in the past. I understand this, right? Chemical imbalances can lead to changes in mood. Now, because I said I'm a compatibilist, mood can also lead back to changes in chemical imbalance. I know not everyone will agree with that. All this is to say, we live in a society that thinks that the material world causes everything. We inherited that from our industrial revolution forefathers, and like we inherited this mechanistic way of viewing the universe. So it is understandable, although not excusable, for someone who has come post-industrial revolution, for someone who's come out of a world that perceives the human person as a fundamentally mechanistic object, to think, oh, well, if there's more black people in prison, or let's say a different gap, like I don't want to go into details right now, but like the wealth gap. The wealth gap is an opportunity gap created by redlining, created by historically marginalized groups, created by intergenerational wealth, created in part because of slavery, because of all, like literally Jamila Jones talks about this. Intergenerational wealth, we'll get into that in more details later. But this mechanistic way of viewing the world, you might see these differences in society and say, those differences in society that I can perceive with my eyes and that with the data, those are mechanistically determined by the biology. This is what I meant when I said reductive materialistic determinism. Reductivism is the claim that all that you are is just your atoms and your chemicals, driving you like a robot. That's reductionism. Determinism is you have no choice in the matter, and materialism is all that you are is just stuff, right? I don't know about it because I like consciousness as a thing, but whoa, we are so off track because we thought we were doing race as a social construct, and now we're doing like entry-level philosophy of mind. I'm so sorry. We've crossed 1 a.m. and I'm in a closet with a microphone. You asked me to do this. Okay, back on track. So I, if you are not picking up, am not a reductive, determinist materialist. But because we came out of the Industrial Revolution, because we came out of this post-scientific revolution, those intuitions are in the air. Those metaphysical intuitions are in the air, and they're in fact convenient for someone who says, oh, there's a maternal mortality gap. I don't want to address the maternal mortality gap. I'm just going to blame it on DNA and move on with my life. And that's where I said that we would get a little bit into the dark side here. That's where the dark side, my camera's overheating. Oh no, that's new. I didn't know that it would happen. Okay, well, we're chancing it. The camera doesn't want me to talk about the dark side. That's where we can see that I'm going to open this. Sorry, I'm changing the vibe on the video, but I'm going to get a little more air in here, and hopefully that'll help cool down the camera. Wowzer. Okay. That's where I got to pause it. And then restart. I wanted to do it in one take, but perfectionism is stupid because if it dies, it will probably corrupt the file and I'll have to start over. Your Eminences and Your Excellencies, we are back, but I'm going to pause and double check that the audio is still going because I'm maniacal like that. It's good, it's working, and while I was letting my camera cool off, I got a little water, and I was able to realize that my intuition's pulling me to non-reductive materialistic determinism. I've said all the words wrong. I was so excited about the idea, I just botched it. But while I was getting water, I was able to realize that my intuition pulling me in the direction of Intro to Philosophy of Mind concepts about reductive, physicalist, I've already lost track of what it is. I promise it'll come back as I'm explaining it. I'm just complicated words. Sometimes philosophers are dumb and they make up words for stuff that they should just use regular words. I left philosophy for a reason, but what I realized while I was getting water is that my intuition about reductive materialism is determinist, reductive materialist determinism, or whatever order I said those in the past. I told you I'd find it, is actually connected to this in a really important way. And now that all the pieces are in place, we finally have the ability to lay it all out, put it all together, connect all the dots, and cross all the I's and dot the T's. And here's how. I can't believe we're doing philosophy of mind. I can't believe we have done this. I can't believe you've done this. But here we are. Part of the idea behind, and sorry, we're just gonna do it. We're gonna do it. Philosophy teaching is a value add too. part of the idea that we've just explained is that we have this moral intuition, we have this metaphysical intuition that everything that we are as a society is ultimately determined by molecules and atoms and chemical laws and Newtonian physics, right? Physicalist determinism or materialist determinism. We have this intuition in society. And as I say that out loud, I know that many people reject that intuition. Many people believe in free will. They believe in consciousness. They believe that they have control over their destinies. And I'm one of those people. I have a fancy way to get there called compatibilism, but there's other ways to get there. And this is a thing that people believe. People believe that there's a top-down causality. What do I mean by that? If you believe in free will, and I can't believe I'm doing this, but I've got to stop undermining myself. I can't believe I'm doing this, but it will get us back to race being socially constructed, I promise. If you believe in free will, then you believe in a kind of top-down causality. You believe that the whole essence of you, the whole person that you are, can change your neurology, can change your biology, I should say, because we're talking about race as a social construct as opposed to a biological construct. Your person can change your biology. And this is not a trivial claim, right? It has massive metaphysical ramifications that philosophers have been debating and cutting down forests to make paper and spilling gallons of ink to answer this question. But we're also talking about it all the time in therapy, in mindfulness, and in exercise. Like, we think that if we exercise, we can change our bodies, which we can, right? In a sense that I know, I went to philosophy grad school. I know people are going to split hairs on this claim. But in a sense, you going to the gym is a kind of top-down causality, right? I decided that I want to go to the gym, and the fact that I went to the gym changed the rest of me, which then changes my mood, which then changes lots of things about me, and makes me more primed to learn shit. If you watch my videos about exercise and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, deciding to go to the gym changes the biology, and then the biology helps you decide to go to the gym in the future or not, right? It's not just that there's a bottom-up causality in the materialist, mechanistic, post-industrial revolution way of viewing the world. It's also that there's this top-down causality, and that if you mindfully engage with your emotions, you can change the biology. People studied this with Buddhist monks, right? They were sitting around meditating, changed their neurology. Now, if you're hair splitty and you're obnoxious and you're doing the hair splitty obnoxious philosopher moves, I know you. I see you. You're like, oh, bunch. You only decided to be mindful, and you're only capable of being mindful because of the fact that your brain was doing a thing, and it's still reductive materialism. Blah, blah, blah. One, shut up. You're annoying. Nobody likes moral philosophy professors. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that, but I've had that bottled up for a long time. Like, it is the hair splitty obnoxious way. Obviously, it's the profession, but I've left the profession, and I understand where you're coming from. But I also think in terms of I should totally cut this whole bit. Nobody cares about my beef with philosophy as an institution. I do have a lot of beef with philosophy as an institution, but in just zooming it back to the popular cultural understanding of things, mindfulness and the concept of manifesting, which is probably like whatever, will not interrogate whether or not that is real, and exercise and all these things that we do, these are top-down causalities. We affect the biology of our body with the mental choices that we make. Mental choices being a emergent property, a non-reductive property of what it means to be a human. A rock cannot will itself to go to the gym. It doesn't have the property of will, nor does it have arms to get swole. A rock cannot do this. A bird might be able to do this to a smaller degree, depending on your views of consciousness. I can't believe we're talking about consciousness so much, but whatever. We're here, I'm committed, we're doing it. But a human person can. A human person has the emergent property of consciousness. A human person has the emergent property of choice, probably. And that emergent property allows a human person to influence a human person's own biology. Whoa, bonkers, right? Screw you, Industrial Revolution. Screw you, deterministic causality, right? Wow, that's wild. That's wild. And it seems like the mindfulness research is pointing in that direction. And if you want to just take a different path, right, it seems like even choosing to take a medication that might change your mood is a thing that you can do to your biology, right? In consultation with a psychiatrist, right? Be safe. But whoa, that's really cool. And on an individual level, I would say, I don't know, 50, 70 made up numbers that I'm just completely BSing. A large percentage of people believe that they get to choose things. A large percentage of people believe this. Calculating economists don't. They know that marketing influences your decisions. Calculating advertisers, creating bot-generated disinformation campaigns think that you don't, and they think that they can influence your decisions, and which they kind of can, which is scary. But I also have another video about that, the Incredibles 2 video. It's called The Real Life Screenslaver. At least that's what it's called right now. It's in my YouTube channel talking about disinformation, Cambridge Analytica. The title keeps changing because I'm indecisive. Cool. But most of us believe in free will. Most of us believe that consciousness has this top-down causal property. And we also believe that, like, if you don't drink water, you're grumpy. So we also believe in bottom-up causality. So there's top-down and there's bottom-up causality. And the best way, the most robust way, the way that I believe as the person with a microphone in the closet at 1 a.m. with a bioethics degree and a physics degree and a philosophy degree is that actually it's both. You don't have to pick one or the other. We get both. We get bottom-up causality and we get top-down causality. And here's where we pull it back, and those top-down causal elements show up in the biology, and the biological elements show up in the mental states. So I'm an epiphenomenalist who is a compatibilist, is a non-reductive materialist, but I'm showing more words, and we're done with that. Screw the philosophy. We're done with it. No more. What I mean by this and why this is important is because recognizing top-down causality, that the larger emergent system can have an effect on the smaller subcomponents of the system, is the metaphysics that we need to understand that race is a social construct. Because we have said that we can reify race with our social policy. We have said that we can create a black-white maternal mortality gap with our social policy, with our levels of implicit bias, with our access to the healthcare system, with our mistraining of doctors. We can create racial gaps in a top-down causal way. That is not a bottom-up causality. A bottom-up causality that says, that lets us off the hook. That just says, that difference is just caused by genetics. Oops. Next problem. Genetics caused it. That bottom-up causal explanation misses the fact that our social systems have the power to have a collective biological effect. And that sounds abstract, and it might even sound interesting to you. And I hope that it does. Part of what I need to do to teach is to entertain and keep interest and not just give you facts. I hope that that is an interesting revelation for you. But that we create race as a society, that we create the differences that we perceive to be genetic. That is worth dwelling on. And if you are realizing it right now, then you are just like me, because it took me a long time to piece all that together. It was much easier for me to believe that race was only genetic, and that the only genetic nature of race was causing the perceptual differences in society. And as I said before, it's plausible to perceive the world that way, because we see skin color being different. We see heights being different. We see face shape being different. We don't need phrenology. We see it. And so it's easy to think that those differences those bottom-up causal differences are the real cause of the racial discrepancies that we see. But I hope that I at least convinced some of you that it is also plausible that there might be top-down causal elements. And before I get to the dark side, which maybe will be the next episode, it's worth getting to the example of the fetal birth weight gap one last time. We, in our social policy, have created a biological effect. We created a racial difference with social policy. While my camera overheated, I went and looked at page 70 whatever, where Dorothy Roberts talks about a time in American history where that fetal birth weight gap started to close. For those of you that are listening, I just did a very dramatic gesture of my hands moving together. There was a time in history where the fetal birth weight gap in the United States started to decrease. When was that? I think I can't get the date exactly right. I'm bad with dates. 1966 to 1980, when food stamp programs were more funded. Following legislation changes in the 80s, those fetal birth weight gaps started to increase. Policy influenced biology in a measurable way. It's a top-down causality, a social scale free will, not just the genetics of these racial categories that we constructed changing people's bodies, but in fact, the story that we tell about who deserves food and who doesn't, which is a social scale, collective decision that we make, leading to a policy change that led to a discrepancy that showed up in the biology. We reify race collectively, socially, with the social policies that we create, the individual choices that we make on a day-to-day basis, and importantly, as Bryan Stevenson says so eloquently in his Johns Hopkins graduation speech on YouTube, the narrative battle. The narrative of racial difference in this country has a top-down causal effect. The narrative of racial difference causes racial difference to show up in the biology. And this is where the true dark side shows. Because that narrative of racial difference is not just a justification for horrible, heinous things being done. It's also a justification for, and I've got to say the word TikTok would demonetize me, but we're not on TikTok, we're on a podcast, right? White supremacy, the Proud Boys, much of the rhetoric that came from Trump over the last few years is a rhetoric of great replacement theory, which is the stepson, grandson of white supremacy. Great replacement theory is a theory that I almost don't want to get into this because I've already talked about too many things, but I'll just gesture at it. To say that these narratives of racial difference create the racial difference and then further justify their own existence. And we've just been hanging out in the world of bioethics and in the world of metaphysics. But the world we haven't touched yet is ethics, which is what my actual degree is in, right? But not that it matters. People with ethics degrees are not, statistically speaking, more ethical than people without ethics degrees. It's been studied by people with ethics degrees, which is a delightful fact. What I mean by that is we talked about bioethics. We talked about biology, and we've talked about metaphysics. Metaphysics being, is free. Do we have free will? Is sort of a metaphysical question because it's a question about does consciousness have causal power? All these things. We've been talking in a very grounded sense, and I know some philosophers will object to my simplification of this explanation, but we've been talking about the facts, what is, and we haven't been talking at all about what should be. Some people call this the fact-value distinction. Some of the work of the world is just describing things as they are, but some of the work of the world is describing how things should be. So I'll put the question to you. Should we be reifying race in such a way that we systematically deprive black mothers of their lives? Should we be reifying race in such a way that we deprive black people in this country from accessing economic wealth? Should we be doing that? It is a fact that we are. Should we? If you're still listening, I would hope that you understand that the answer is obviously we should not be doing it. With this social collective scale free will that we have, to create policy that has a top-down effect. We should be creating policy that, this is a nuanced claim, unreifies race. At least in terms of the medical outcomes, the economic outcomes. This is part of why affirmative action is necessary. Because when your leg is broken, you don't just need time, you need a cast. You need extra resources to heal. But I know I'll lose people if I go too far into that, so we'll talk about it later when we have a little bit more time. We're reaching the end of what I think is a reasonable length of a podcast here. So at the top, we asked the question, is race socially constructed? And we explained that there are some elements of race that really do seem like they're bottom-up caused. Genetics causes a difference in melanin. Genetics causes a difference in hair texture. But part of what is meant in the insight that race is socially constructed is that the meaningful differences between the races, the measurable differences, the ones that matter morally, the ones that matter ethically, those differences are made up by us. And we police them and keep them real. On a daily basis, individually, in microaggressions, and in hiring decisions, and on a collective scale when we make social policy. The fetal birth weight gap decreased when food stamps were more available. If we make resources available where they are needed, we can have effects. An example I didn't talk about at all, which is hilarious because I used to be a teacher. Sorry, I got a high school physics teacher. I got distracted talking about philosophy of mind. Is the education system where these differences in resources show up so severely. Part of why I left teaching is because being only a teacher didn't address enough of the top-down causal social scale issues that were leading to these educational inequalities. And I shouldn't say just a teacher. I don't mean to bash the work of teachers. I have so much respect for teachers. I just realized that my skills lie more in research. My skills lie more in this thing that we're doing right now. And that 140 of you signed up on Patreon for. Shameless plug, baby. We're podcasting. And so I moved in this direction, got an ethics degree and started a TikTok channel and whatever the hell my life is right now. But for the sake of ending this in a non-jaded way, while there are genetic differences across ethnic groups, most of the racial categories that we have are imposed by society, by map drawers, in a way that Johnny Harris, I'm sure, would love. And we are coaxing those categories out of the contemporary genetic models, not finding them there naturally. Our thumbs are on the scale to reproduce the categories that we have socially created and we are collectively comfortable with. And as a result, we create social policies that mirror these contrived categories. And those social policies that mirror the contrived categories have a top-down effect, and they eventually show up in the biology in a vicious loop of the creation, the reification of race in this country. And in the dark side background of that are lurking demons of white supremacy that are ethically okay with a maternal mortality gap because they have a morally bankrupt metaphysics, a morally bankrupt ethics, that their race somehow is superior. And they interpret the data to mean that. But that interpretation of the data is imposed on the data. It is a collective narrative. And as Stevenson says, we must win that narrative battle. And we can't fight that narrative battle without challenging narratives. So here we are. So I hope that I've walked you through enough of this to have convinced some of you. And if I haven't, I hope that I've walked you through enough book titles that if you object to what I say, you can do your homework and go read it. You can read those follow-up studies about the anti-Arab sentiment in 9/11, post-9/11 America, leading to a measurable difference in fetal birth weight across different names. You can read the follow-up studies about the food stamp program and how if we made food more available to people, we likely would see many of these these discrepancies disappear. Food being a metonymy, a stand-in for all the social resources, which I've discussed at length in other places when I talk about Heather McGhee's work. I'm obsessed with Heather McGhee. She's brilliant. And I'll talk about her more, maybe in the next episode, though I hinted at a bunch of things that maybe could be in the next episode, so I don't know. Lord knows what will happen at 12:30, now 1:30 in the morning in a closet with a microphone on a Tuesday. I'm Charlie. I have most of my content on TikTok and YouTube and Instagram, but we're expanding by popular request to the long form. And I'm glad that you pressed me into doing this because I think many of these things are, simply put, too nuanced to be contained in 270 seconds of a tightly edited TikTok video. So thank you for the encouragement. Thank you for listening. And consider joining on Patreon if you want. And if you can, rather, if you are able to do that. And if you cannot, or if you're extra interested in, you can do both. You could subscribe on YouTube also. My sign-off has no procedure. I don't know what to say. I've never done a podcast before. There's supposed to be music. In lieu of music, I will not sing for you tonight, but a song that has been on my mind is Moana, the song from Moana, where she finds the goddess whose heart has been stolen by a corrupt world. And she says that I've crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. They have stolen the heart from inside you. I don't know the next line. I'm going to Google it. Why not? It's my podcast. Safari. Moana. Whoa, that is too bright. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not disrespecting your time by doing this in front of you. I can't connect it to what I've said, but I'll call it a teaser for the next episode. I have crossed the horizon to find you. I know your name. They have stolen the heart from inside you. But this does not define you. This is not who you are. You know who you are. I said I couldn't connect it, but I totally lied. It is very connectable. Much of the trauma that is imposed on people. And we cope with trauma in the ways that we can. Too much nuance. This podcast is meant to be... Sorry, not too much nuance. I'm not going to make more claims. I don't like to make claims that I can't back up with rigorous research-based evidence, which I can't do with these claims I'm about to make. So I will sign off for now. I'm Charlie. This is That Makes Sense to Me, the podcast, tentatively called Make It Make Sense. I don't know. Write something in comments. Let me know. We'll see where it goes. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I will talk to you in the next one.